You are walking across a dry, sun-baked landscape under a relentless sky. Ahead of you, sweeping valleys stretch out to the very edge of the horizon. There is no signpost standing by the trail warning you. You are now leaving Africa. There are no maps to fold, no tribal leaders shouting speeches about a grand global conquest. To you, and the small band walking beside you, what lies ahead is simply another hill and a fragile hope that on the other side of that horizon, there is a watering hole that hasn't dried up yet. You walk a few more miles. A few weeks later, your family sets up a new camp in an unfamiliar valley. Then your children grow up and they take their own steps just a little further from where they were born. It wouldn't be until thousands of years later that the descendants of those walkers would realize the truth. They had set foot on an entirely different continent. At what exact moment did a simple walk in search of drinking water transform into the greatest migration in human history? We often hear the story of human expansion told as a single triumphant exodus. One day our ancestors boldly marched out of Africa to conquer the globe. But the scientific reality paints a picture that is far more complex, unforgiving, and deeply haunting. Our species, Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa more than 300,000 years ago. And long before the successful wave that gave rise to the vast majority of modern non-African populations today, our ancestors tried to cross the continent's borders multiple times. Fossil fragments discovered in Mislia Cave in the Levant reveal that early modern humans had reached Western Asia nearly 200,000 years ago, but they vanished. Those early pioneers likely succumbed to shifting climates, became isolated in expanding deserts, or were forced to retreat back to their homelands. The genetic records of humanity show that our story of leaving Africa did not begin with instant success. It began with countless failed attempts and quiet tragedies that were nearly erased from human memory forever. So why did a wave of migration that occurred roughly between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago succeed so miraculously, unlocking the gateway to the entire world? The answer isn't that Africa suddenly became a dead, uninhabitable wasteland they had to escape. On the contrary, the secret lies in the sheer diversity of Africa itself. Throughout the vast stretches of prehistoric time, the African continent was never a single monotonous environment. It was a dynamic, ever-changing world, containing dense rainforests, sweeping savannas, brutal deserts, high mountain ranges, and wind-swept coastlines. Long before they ever learned to survive in strange lands across the globe, early humans were forced to adapt to dozens of different Africans located right inside the continent of their birth. That relentless environmental pressure forged Homo sapiens into a species with an extraordinary ecological flexibility. We didn't depend on a single type of food. We learned to modify our tool-making techniques to match whatever local stone was available. We figured out how to thrive in both the wettest jungles and the driest plains. And then, nature opened a window. Today, when we look at the Arabian Peninsula, we see an endless ocean of sand, a barren wall that is virtually impossible to cross on foot without modern technology. But Earth's climate is a massive swinging pendulum. During short, fleeting intervals of the Pleistocene epoch, shifting monsoon patterns drenched this arid region with heavy rainfall. The Arabian Peninsula transformed. The deserts vanished, giving way to seasonal rivers, freshwater lakes, and rolling green grasslands teeming with grazing herbivores. Scientists refer to these periods as climate windows, or the eras of green Arabia. Our ancestors didn't conquer the desert. They simply and unconsciously waited for nature to turn the traffic light from red to green. When those lush green corridors opened up, humans naturally followed the herds of game weaving their way through temporary wetland trails. These climate windows only lasted for a few thousand years, a mere blink of an eye on the geological timescale. When the desert returned and the door swung shut behind them, humans were already on the other side. How many pathways carried them across modern science is still piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. Some groups may have traveled a northern route following the fertile Nile River and crossing the Sinai Peninsula into the Levant at the western edge of Asia. Others likely took a southern route toward the Horn of Africa, crossing the Bab el-Mandeb Strait to step onto the southern tip of Arabia during glacial periods that significantly lowered global sea levels. In all likelihood, there wasn't just one exclusive highway. Different groups across different generations slipped through different corridors depending on the shifting rhythm of the Earth. But there is a monumental shift in perspective that you need to make. Not a single one of those ancient people ever thought of themselves as migrating. Today, when we speak of migration, we think of departure points, destinations, travel schedules, and a clear endgame. The greatest expansion of humanity happened nothing like that. To those early humans, there was no concept of leaving Africa. There was only finding the next livable spot to build a campfire. When a local water source began to shrink, or when the gazelle herds shifted their grazing grounds, they packed up their animal hides, gathered their dry tinder, and moved a few days' walk into the next valley. No single person lived long enough to witness a transcontinental journey. Each generation only crossed the next visible horizon. The most epic journey in human history was accomplished by people who had no idea that they were walking around the world. So what did they carry with them into the unknown? A few sharp flint flakes, strips of dried meat, children strapped to their backs, and glowing embers carefully packed inside bundles of bark to preserve heat. But the most valuable asset that kept them alive across lands where no human foot had ever trod weighed absolutely nothing. It was their invisible treasury of collective knowledge. They didn't carry printed maps, but they carried elders who knew how to read the language of the sky and the soil. People who could look at the shape of a distant cloud and predict a violent storm. People who could taste the wind to trace the direction of underground water. People who knew instantly which plants offered nourishment and which contained lethal poison. If a band of humans lost all their weapons, they could simply break local rocks to shape new tools. But if they lost the elders who held their survival memory, the entire group would quickly be swallowed by the wilderness. Yet even the greatest survival knowledge couldn't save an isolated, solitary group. Long before the birth of cities or written language, early humans built intricate social networks spanning hundreds of miles. A small hunter-gatherer band of just a few dozen people is a fragile, vulnerable unit. If a harsh winter lingered too long, if an epidemic struck, or if their best hunters suddenly died, an isolated group faced immediate extinction. To survive, they had to maintain strong, active lifelines with neighboring tribes. They met seasonally to trade rare stones, share vital intelligence about animal movements, intermarry to ensure healthy genetic diversity, and above all, take each other in when a local territory suffered a famine. Our ancestors populated a new world, not because they were the strongest or the most ruthless fighters. They succeeded because they were the species that knew how to stay deeply connected to one another. And this brings us to a stunning paradox in human anthropology. Modern genetic studies reveal a breathtaking truth about our population history. Almost all the billions of humans living outside of Africa today across Europe, Asia, the Americas, and Oceania can trace their ancestry back to a surprisingly small founding population. Recent research models suggest that after stepping out of the African homeland, the common ancestors of all modern Eurasians may have been parked for thousands of years in an area around the Persian Plateau, a region spanning parts of modern-day Iran, Iraq, and Arabia, before branching out across the globe around 45,000 years ago. For millennia, the entire future of non-African humanity was contained inside a population that was likely smaller than a modern suburban neighborhood. It was a dramatic genetic bottleneck, a razor-thin margin of survival, where just one bad run of climatic luck could have wiped our story from the earth completely. And when those resilient, adaptable people finally stepped out of the plateau and expanded deeper into Eurasia, they were met with a massive surprise. The world outside of Africa was not empty. The columns of campfire smoke rising from cave mouths across Western Asia and Europe didn't belong to Homo sapiens. They belonged to Neanderthals, our muscular, cold-adapted cousins, who had successfully dominated those northern landscapes for hundreds of thousands of years. Moving further east into the high mountains and dense forests of Asia, our ancestors encountered the Denisovans and potentially other ancient human groups that science has yet to fully uncover. How did those dramatic encounters play out? There were certainly conflicts, brutal territorial clashes between rival hunting bands competing for the exact same resources. But violence wasn't the whole story. Genetic science has unlocked a profoundly human truth. They drew close to one another, they shared campfires, and they fell in love. Homo sapiens did not simply march across the globe and wipe out every other human species in absolute isolation. In many places, we merged with them. Today, the average person of Eurasian descent carries between 1% and 2% Neanderthal DNA in their cells. In populations across Melanesia and indigenous Australia, genetic code from Denisovans still flows through their bloodlines, helping modern bodies adapt to local altitudes and regional immune threats. We didn't just replace them. A piece of them became us, and they continue to live on inside your very DNA today. From that central hub in Western Asia, the great river of humanity began to branch out like the massive roots of an ancient tree. Some branches poured south, crossing the sun-drenched landscapes of South Asia. Others pushed eastward, reaching the dense forests and vast plains of East Asia. Some turned northwest, walking into a cooling European continent that was preparing for an ice age. And then there were those who achieved a feat that defies imagination in Southeast Asia. Early humans looked out across open ocean, constructed primitive rafts, and navigated dangerous deep-water straits to land on Sahul, the ancient supercontinent that once connected Australia and New Guinea. This global spread was never a neat, orderly line marching across a map. It was a messy living web. Groups broke apart, wandered off. Reunited generations later, blended together, and were sometimes wiped out by sudden local freezes, only for new groups to migrate in and fill the void. Many bands even reversed direction, migrating back deep into Africa, turning human history into an endless two-way cross-current of movement. When you sit here today, looking at the borders that divide nations, the oceans that separate continents, or the different skin tones across the globe, it is so easy to forget that we all share the exact same starting point. That epic migration isn't just trapped inside museum glass or dusty archaeological textbooks. It is actively living inside your body right now. Every time you look at a distant horizon and feel a quiet, unexplained urge to see what lies behind the next hill. Every time your body instinctively shivers or sweats to adapt to the temperature. Every time you feel a deep psychological need to connect with others for safety. That is the memory of those ancient walkers echoing inside you. Some humans left Africa tens of thousands of years ago. But Africa never truly left humanity. We often ask ourselves, what was the ultimate secret that allowed our species to occupy the entire planet? Was it because our brains were slightly larger? Was it our complex spoken language, our mastery of fire, or our sharper blades? All of those tools mattered. But there is a reason far deeper than all of them. The early bands who left Africa too soon and vanished weren't less intelligent or less brave than we are. They simply hit bad climate timing, became isolated without a safety network, or suffered a run of bad luck that nature didn't allow them to undo. Perhaps Homo sapiens inherited the Earth not because we executed one flawless, perfect migration. We succeeded because after every tragic failure, after every band that fell in the desert or surrendered to the glacial ice, there was always another group in another generation who stubbornly tied their animal hides, picked up their dry tinder, and took one more step over the horizon. Our greatest evolutionary adaptation wasn't knowing exactly where we were going. It was having the relentless courage to keep walking, even when nobody knew what was waiting on the other side of the world.